Welcome, dear listener, to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. Tonight, we gather by the hearth to unfold the tale of Miss Marple and the poison by the hearth. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where tea is served promptly at 4 and gossip travels faster than the morning post, death has arrived uninvited. Colonel Edmund Hargrove, a gentleman of means and temper, has been found lifeless in his favourite chair. The fire still burns brightly. The teacup sits empty by his side. Miss Jane Marple, that most observant of neighbours, senses something amiss beneath the polite condolences. The rain taps softly at the windows. The hearth crackles with warmth, yet a chill settles over Ashwood House. In this village, secrets do not stay buried long. They rise like smoke and settle like ash. Miss Marple knows this well. She has seen it all before in the small dramas of village life. Where are you listening from this evening? Perhaps by your own fireside, a cup of tea in hand, ready to unravel a mystery woven from poison, inheritance, and the quiet observations of an elderly lady who knits and watches. And now, dear listener, we turn to Chapter 1, where our mystery properly begins. Chapter 1. The Gentleman's Last Evening. The evening of November 12th began as so many do in St. Mary Mead. The air held the crisp bite of approaching winter. Smoke rose from chimneys in neat grey lines. Lights glowed warmly in cottage windows. At Ashwood House, Colonel Edmund Hargrove prepared to receive guests. The colonel was a man of habit and firm opinion. He had served in India for 20 years. He returned to England with a modest fortune and a sharp tongue. His home stood at the edge of the village, surrounded by gardens he tended himself. He grew roses, foxglove, and oleander. He took pride in his plants. That evening the drawing-room was arranged for company. The fire burned brightly in the hearth. Sherry decanters stood ready on the sideboard. Mrs. Crane, the housekeeper, ensured everything was in place. She moved quietly through the rooms. Her hands were steady. Her expression was calm. The guests arrived at 7. Catherine Hargrove came first. She was the colonel's niece, a young woman of 28 with intelligent eyes. She lived in the village and visited often. She kissed her uncle's cheek and took her seat near the fire. Dr. Fielding arrived next. He had been the family physician for 15 years. He was a stout man with kind eyes and a gentle manner. He shook the colonel's hand and accepted a glass of sherry. George Whitley came last. He was a business associate of the colonel. He dealt in property and investments. He was a lean man with nervous hands. He smiled too much and spoke too quickly. The colonel greeted him coolly. Miss Jane Marple arrived briefly at 8. She lived 3 doors down in a cottage with a neat garden. She had been invited for tea earlier that week and came to return a borrowed book. She wore a wool coat and carried an umbrella. The colonel welcomed her warmly. She stayed only 15 minutes. She sipped tea by the fire and observed the room. The conversation that evening was polite but strained. Catherine spoke of village matters. Dr. Fielding discussed the health of mutual friends. George Whitley mentioned investments that the colonel dismissed curtly. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. The sherry was poured again. Miss Marple noticed small things. Catherine avoided looking at her uncle directly. George's hands shook slightly when he lifted his glass. Mrs. Crane entered twice to tend the fire, and each time her gaze lingered on the colonel. Dr. Fielding seemed tired. Miss Marple thanked the colonel for the tea and took her leave. She walked home through the darkening streets. The rain had begun to fall lightly. She thought of the tension in that warm room. She thought of the way Catherine had flinched when the colonel spoke sharply to George. She thought of the teacup left near the hearth. The evening continued without her. The guests remained until 11. The conversation grew quieter. The fire burned lower. Mrs. Crane brought the colonel his evening tea at 10:30. He drank it slowly. He dismissed his guests at 11. Catherine kissed his cheek again. Dr. Fielding shook his hand. George left quickly. The front door closed. Mrs. Crane cleared the glasses and retired to her cottage. The colonel sat alone by the fire. At midnight, Mrs. Crane returned to check the doors. She found the colonel slumped in his chair. His face was pale. His breathing was shallow. She called for Dr. Fielding immediately. Dr. Fielding arrived within 20 minutes. He examined the colonel. He listened to his heart. He checked his pulse. The colonel died at 10 past midnight. Dr. Fielding noted the time carefully. He looked at the teacup. He smelled the faint, bitter residue. He said nothing yet. The house fell into silence. Mrs. Crane stood in the doorway, her hands clasped. Dr. Fielding covered the colonel with a blanket. He asked Mrs. Crane what the colonel had eaten that evening. She listed the items carefully. Sherry, biscuits, tea. Dr. Fielding asked who had prepared the tea. Mrs. Crane said she had. She had brought it to him in his study. She had left it on the table by the fire. She had not stayed to watch him drink it. She returned to her cottage. Dr. Fielding asked who else had entered the room after that. Mrs. Crane hesitated. She said she heard footsteps in the hall near midnight. She could not say whose. She was in her cottage. She heard the front door close softly. She thought nothing of it at the time. Dr. Fielding examined the teacup more closely. The residue was thin but present. The scent was faint, almost sweet. He thought of digitalis. He thought of foxglove. He knew the colonel grew it in his garden. He decided to wait for morning to speak further. Catherine was summoned at dawn. She arrived pale and shaken. She wept by the fire. She said her uncle had been difficult, but she loved him. She said she had argued with him recently. She did not say why. George Whitley came when he heard the news. He expressed shock. He said the colonel had been in good health. He offered assistance. Dr. Fielding thanked him and sent him away. Miss Marple learned of the death at breakfast. Her maid brought the news from the village. Miss Marple set down her teacup. She thought of the evening before. She thought of the bitter residue she had noticed in the colonel's cup when she visited. She had said nothing then. She thought of it now. She walked to Ashwood House. She brought a basket of scones. She offered condolences to Catherine. She spoke briefly with Mrs. Crane. She asked gentle questions. She listened carefully. She noticed the teacup had been washed. She noticed the hearth had been swept. Inspector Craddock arrived from Much Benham at noon. He was a tall man with serious eyes. He knew Miss Marple from previous cases. He greeted her respectfully. He began his interviews in the drawing-room. Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner. She knitted. She listened. She observed. Inspector Craddock questioned Catherine first. She admitted the argument. She said her uncle had removed her from his will. She wept again. She said she had not wished him dead. Inspector Craddock questioned George Whitley next. George admitted owing the colonel money. He said the colonel had refused further loans. He denied anger. He seemed nervous. Inspector Craddock questioned Mrs. Crane last. She repeated what she had told Dr. Fielding. She mentioned the footsteps. She mentioned the closed door. She said nothing of the scent. Inspector Craddock thanked her. Miss Marple approached Inspector Craddock as he prepared to leave. She mentioned the foxglove in the garden. She mentioned the faint, bitter scent she had noticed the evening before. She suggested a toxicology report. Inspector Craddock agreed. The body was taken to Much Benham. The house was sealed. The village buzzed with whispers. Death had come quietly to Ashwood House. The hearth still held warmth. The teacup still held secrets. Miss Marple returned home. She sat by her own fire. She thought of human nature. She thought of greed and fear. She thought of the way poison hides in plain sight. She thought of a case she had known years ago. A gardener in her nephew's parish had died the same way. The rain continued to fall. The fire crackled softly. Miss Marple picked up her knitting. The mystery had only just begun. Chapter 2. The morning after dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with pale grey light. The rain had stopped. The village stirred slowly. News of Colonel Hargrove's death spread from cottage to cottage. The postman carried it with the morning mail. The grocer shared it across the counter. The vicar heard it from 3 separate sources before breakfast. Miss Marple rose early. She tended her garden briefly. The soil was damp from the rain. The roses drooped. She thought of the colonel's garden. She thought of the foxglove that grew there in abundance. She thought of how easy it would be to harvest the leaves. She thought of how simple it would be to steep them like tea. She walked to the village shop. Mrs. Gibbons greeted her with solemn eyes. The death was discussed in hushed tones. Mrs. Gibbons said it was a tragedy. She said the Colonel had seemed well. She said Catherine would inherit everything. Miss Marple corrected her gently. She said the will had been changed. Mrs. Gibbons's eyes widened. She asked how Miss Marple knew. Miss Marple said only that such things are often whispered before they are confirmed. She purchased her items and left. Inspector Craddock returned to Ashwood House at 9. He brought a constable with him. The house was examined thoroughly. The study was photographed. The teacup was taken as evidence. The hearth was inspected. Ash samples were collected. Dr. Fielding provided his preliminary report. He listed heart failure as the cause. He noted the faint bitter residue in the teacup. He suggested poison but hesitated to confirm it. He said the toxicology report would take 3 days. Inspector Craddock thanked him. A new figure appeared that morning. Thomas Hargrove arrived at Ashwood House at 10. He was the Colonel's younger brother. He had left England 20 years ago after a family quarrel. He had lived abroad in Ceylon. His return was unexpected. Catherine greeted him at the door. She was surprised. She had not known he was in England. Thomas embraced her briefly. He said he had returned 3 days prior. He said he had hoped to reconcile with his brother. He said he was too late. Inspector Craddock interviewed Thomas in the drawing room. Thomas explained that he had written to the Colonel 6 months ago. The letters were not answered. He had come to England regardless. He stayed at the Blue Boar Inn. He had not visited Ashwood House before the death. He claimed he did not know the Colonel had died until that morning. Inspector Craddock asked why Thomas had not visited sooner. Thomas said he feared rejection. He said the quarrel had been bitter. He said time had softened his pride. He wished only to make peace. Inspector Craddock noted the timing. He said nothing further. Miss Marple arrived at 11 with a basket of provisions for Catherine. She was admitted by Mrs. Crane. She offered quiet sympathy. She met Thomas briefly in the hall. She observed him carefully. He was tall and lean, with grey hair and tired eyes. He wore a ring on his left hand. She recognized it. The Colonel had worn an identical one. She asked Thomas gently about his time abroad. He spoke of Ceylon with fondness. He spoke of tea plantations and heath. He mentioned the plants that grew there. He mentioned how much he had learned of botany. Miss Marple listened. She asked if he had learned of poisons. Thomas smiled faintly. He said everyone who lives in the tropics learns such things. It is a matter of survival. Miss Marple excused herself and joined Mrs. Crane in the kitchen. She asked how the housekeeper was managing. Mrs. Crane said she was well enough. She said the inspector had questioned her thoroughly. She said she had told him everything she remembered. Miss Marple asked gently if Mrs. Crane had noticed anything unusual the night of the death. Mrs. Crane hesitated. She said she had heard footsteps. She said she had heard the front door close. She said she had smelled something faint and bitter near the hearth. She had thought it was the wood burning. Miss Marple asked what kind of scent. Mrs. Crane thought carefully. She said it reminded her of almonds, but not quite. Miss Marple nodded. She said nothing more. Inspector Craddock summoned all parties to the drawing room at noon. He announced that the toxicology report had been expedited. Results would arrive within 2 days. He said the investigation would continue. He asked each person to remain available. He dismissed them. Thomas left for the Blue Boar. Catherine remained at Ashwood House. George Whitley appeared briefly to offer assistance again. Inspector Craddock declined. Miss Marple observed George carefully. His hands were still shaking. He seemed eager to leave. Miss Marple walked home slowly. She stopped by the Colonel's garden. The gate was unlocked. She entered quietly. The foxglove grew along the south wall. The leaves were broad and green. She touched none of them. She simply observed. She noted that several leaves near the base had been recently cut. The stems were clean. The cuts were precise. She left the garden and returned home. She sat by her fire with her knitting. She thought of Thomas and his knowledge of plants. She thought of Catherine and her degree in botany. She thought of George and his nervous hands. She thought of Mrs. Crane and the footsteps she had heard. The village continued to buzz. The vicar called on Miss Marple that afternoon. He expressed sorrow over the Colonel's death. He asked if she thought it was natural. Miss Marple said she thought very little in life was truly natural. The vicar looked puzzled. Miss Marple offered him tea. That evening, Inspector Craddock visited Miss Marple. He sat by her fire. He accepted tea. He said the investigation was difficult. He said every suspect had motive. He said every suspect had access. He asked for her thoughts. Miss Marple said she believed the poison had been administered in the evening tea. She said the hearth had been used to destroy evidence. She said the person who killed the colonel knew the house well. She said they also knew the garden well. She said they had planned carefully. Inspector Craddock asked who she suspected. Miss Marple said she did not know yet. She said human nature reveals itself slowly. She said greed and fear often look the same. She said patience was required. Inspector Craddock thanked her. He finished his tea. He left as the evening darkened. Miss Marple sat alone. The fire burned low. She thought of the almond scent Mrs. Crane had mentioned. She thought of burnt paper. She thought of what secrets the hearth might still hold. The rain began again that night. It tapped softly at the windows. Miss Marple knitted by the fire. She thought of the colonel sitting in his chair. She thought of the poison creeping through his veins. She thought of the person who had stood by the hearth and watched. Justice would come. It always did in St. Mary Mead. The truth would rise like smoke. The hearth would give up its secrets. Miss Marple would see to that. Chapter 3. The Will and the Whisper. The morning of the third day dawned cold and bright. The sun broke through the clouds. The village square filled with its usual bustle, but beneath the ordinary rhythms whispers grew. The word poison passed from lip to lip. No one knew its source. Everyone believed it. Miss Marple walked to the post office. She collected her letters. She heard the whispers as she waited. Mrs. Pike, the postmistress, leaned close. She said the inspector had ordered a toxicology report. She said it meant foul play. Miss Marple said nothing. She simply nodded and left. At Ashwood House, preparations were underway for the reading of the will. Mr. Pembridge, the solicitor, arrived at 10. He was an elderly man with spectacles and a leather case. He greeted Catherine formally. He expressed condolences. He asked that all interested parties be present. Catherine sent word to Thomas at the Blue Boar. She sent word to George Whitley as well. She asked Miss Marple to attend as a family friend. Miss Marple accepted. She arrived at 11 with a basket of biscuits. She was shown to the drawing room. The fire had been lit again. The room felt warm, but the atmosphere was cold. Catherine sat near the window. Her face was pale. Thomas stood by the mantel. He looked uncomfortable. George arrived last. He took a seat near the door. He avoided eye contact. Inspector Craddock stood in the corner. He had asked permission to observe. Mr. Pembridge agreed. The solicitor opened his case and removed the colonel's will. He cleared his throat. He began to read. The will was brief. The colonel had revised it 1 week before his death. The original version left everything to Catherine. The revised version removed her entirely. The estate, including Ashwood House and all investments, passed to Thomas Hargrove. The room fell silent. Catherine stared at the floor. Her hands trembled. Thomas looked shocked. He said he had not known. He said he had not asked for this. George shifted in his seat. His expression was unreadable. Mr. Pembridge continued. The will stated that Catherine had been removed due to personal disagreements. No further explanation was provided. The colonel's signature was clear. 2 witnesses had signed below. One was Mrs. Crane. The other was Dr. Fielding. Catherine rose suddenly. She said the will was unfair. She said her uncle had been cruel. She said she had devoted years to his care. She said she deserved better. Her voice broke. She left the room. Thomas remained by the mantel. He said he did not want the estate. He said he had come only to reconcile. He said he would contest the will if it caused pain. Mr. Pembridge advised against it. He said the document was legally sound. George asked if the colonel had left any debts. Mr. Pembridge said there were none. George asked if there were any bequests to others. Mr. Pembridge said there were not. George nodded slowly. He left without another word. Miss Marple approached Mr. Pembridge after the others had gone. She asked when the will had been changed. He said it was signed on the 5th of November. She asked why. He said the Colonel had not explained. He had simply insisted. She asked who had suggested the change. Mr. Pembridge hesitated. He said the Colonel had acted alone. Miss Marple thanked him. She found Catherine in the garden. The young woman sat on a bench near the roses. Her eyes were red. Miss Marple sat beside her. She said nothing at first. She simply waited. Catherine spoke quietly. She said her uncle had been angry with her. She said he had discovered her engagement. She said he disapproved of the man. She said they had argued bitterly. She said he had threatened to disinherit her. She had not believed him. Miss Marple asked who the man was. Catherine said his name was Peter Grant. He was a schoolteacher. He had no money. The Colonel thought him beneath her. Catherine said she loved him regardless. She said they had planned to marry in the spring. Now she had nothing. Miss Marple asked if Catherine had told Peter of the will. Catherine said she had. She said he had been angry. She said he had urged her to fight. She said she had no strength for it. She said she only wanted peace. Miss Marple asked gently if Catherine had been at Ashwood House the night of the death. Catherine said she had. She said she had brought her uncle his evening tea. She said it was her habit. She said she had left it on the table. She said she had not stayed. She had been too angry. Miss Marple asked if Catherine knew of poisons. Catherine looked at her sharply. She said she had studied botany at university. She said she knew the properties of many plants. She said she had never used such knowledge to harm. She said she swore it. Miss Marple believed her. She said she knew grief from guilt. She said Catherine carried the former, not the latter. Catherine wept. Miss Marple held her hand. They returned to the house together. Inspector Craddock was waiting. He asked to speak with Catherine privately. Miss Marple excused herself. She found Thomas in the study. He was examining the Colonel's books. She asked if he had known about the will. He said he had not. He said he was troubled by it. Miss Marple asked if Thomas had met with Mr. Pembridge recently. Thomas hesitated. He said he had. He said it was 2 weeks prior. He said he had inquired about the estate's status. He said he had wanted to know if reconciliation was possible. He said Mr. Pembridge had told him nothing. Miss Marple asked if Thomas needed money. Thomas smiled faintly. He said everyone needs money. He said his situation in Ceylon had not been prosperous. He said he had hoped his brother might help. He said that hope had died with the Colonel. Miss Marple asked if Thomas had visited the garden. Thomas said he had. He said he admired the foxglove. He said it reminded him of plants in the East. He said such plants were beautiful but dangerous. He said the Colonel had known that well. Miss Marple left Ashwood House as the afternoon faded. She walked through the village. She stopped at the Blue Boar. She asked the innkeeper about Thomas. The innkeeper said Thomas had arrived on the 9th of November. He had kept to himself. He had asked directions to Ashwood House but had not visited. He had seemed troubled. Miss Marple returned home. She sat by her fire. She thought of the will. She thought of Thomas's convenient return. She thought of Catherine's anger. She thought of George's debts. She thought of the hearth and the secrets it held. The village whispered louder now. Poison was no longer a rumour. It was a certainty. The inspector had confirmed it privately to Dr. Fielding. Dr. Fielding had told his wife. His wife had told the vicar's wife. The vicar's wife had told everyone. Miss Marple knitted slowly. She thought of a case she had known long ago. A man had been disinherited by his father. He had returned years later. He had poisoned the old man and claimed ignorance. The truth had come out through a single letter. The letter had been burned, but not completely. Miss Marple set down her knitting. She thought of the hearth at Ashwood House. She thought of the ashes. She thought of Mrs. Crane's mention of a scent. She thought of burnt paper. She decided to speak with Inspector Craddock in the morning. The fire crackled softly. The rain began again. The village slept uneasily. The hearth held its secret still, but not for long. Chapter 4, The Housekeeper's Secret. The fourth morning arrived with heavy clouds. The air smelled of rain. Miss Marple woke early. She dressed warmly. She had decided to visit Mrs. Crane. The housekeeper lived in a small cottage behind Ashwood House. It was neat and plain. Smoke rose from the chimney. Miss Marple knocked gently. Mrs. Crane answered quickly. She looked surprised. She invited Miss Marple inside. The cottage was tidy. A fire burned in the hearth. Tea was prepared. The two women sat across from each other. Miss Marple spoke gently. She said she knew the past days had been difficult. She said she admired Mrs. Crane's composure. Mrs. Crane thanked her quietly. She said she had served the Colonel for 15 years. She said it was her duty to remain steady. Miss Marple asked how Mrs. Crane had come to work for the Colonel. Mrs. Crane said she had been recommended by Thomas Hargrove's family. She had worked for them before the quarrel. She had stayed with the Colonel after Thomas left. She had nowhere else to go. Miss Marple asked if Mrs. Crane had stayed in contact with Thomas. Mrs. Crane said she had not. She said the quarrel had been bitter. She said Thomas had accused the Colonel of dishonesty. She said the Colonel had accused Thomas of greed. She said neither had forgiven the other. Miss Marple asked what the quarrel had been about. Mrs. Crane hesitated. She said it concerned family land. She said Thomas believed the Colonel had cheated him of his share. She said the Colonel claimed Thomas had squandered his inheritance. She said the truth was likely somewhere between. Miss Marple sipped her tea. She asked gently about the night of the Colonel's death. She said she knew Mrs. Crane had spoken to the inspector. She said she knew it must have been difficult. She asked if there was anything Mrs. Crane had not mentioned. Mrs. Crane looked into the fire. She said she had told the inspector everything she remembered. She said she had heard footsteps. She said she had heard the door close. She said she had smelled something strange. Miss Marple asked what kind of strange. Mrs. Crane said it was faint and bitter. She said it reminded her of almonds, but not quite. She said it came from the study. She said she thought it was the wood burning. She said she had not thought more of it until the Colonel died. Miss Marple asked if Mrs. Crane had entered the study after bringing the tea. Mrs. Crane said she had not. She said she had left the tray on the table. She said the Colonel was reading. She said he dismissed her. She returned to her cottage. Miss Marple asked if anyone else had entered the study that evening. Mrs. Crane said she did not know. She said she had been in her cottage. She said she had heard footsteps in the hall near midnight. She said she heard the front door close softly. She said she thought it was one of the guests leaving late. Miss Marple asked if Mrs. Crane had seen who it was. Mrs. Crane said she had not. She said her cottage window faced the garden, not the front. She said she had only heard. She said she regretted not investigating. Miss Marple asked if the fire poker had been moved that night. Mrs. Crane looked startled. She said it had. She said she noticed it the next morning. She said it was on the wrong side of the hearth. She said the Colonel was particular about such things. She said she had not mentioned it to the inspector. She had thought it. Miss Marple said every detail mattered. She asked if anything had been burned in the hearth that night. Mrs. Crane thought carefully. She said the hearth had been swept the next morning. She said there had been more ash than usual. She said she thought perhaps someone had added paper to the fire. Miss Marple asked if the ashes had been kept. Mrs. Crane said they had not. She said they had been emptied into the garden. She said she had not thought to preserve them. She looked distressed. Miss Marple reassured her gently. Miss Marple asked if Mrs. Crane suspected anyone. Mrs. Crane said she did not wish to speak ill of others. Miss Marple said sometimes truth required difficult words. Mrs. Crane sighed. She said she had seen George Whitley argue with the Colonel 2 days before the death. She said the argument had been about money. Miss Marple asked what had been said. Mrs. Crane said George had begged for more time. She said the Colonel had refused. She said the Colonel had threatened legal action. She said George had left in anger. She said his hands had been shaking. Miss Marple asked if Mrs. Crane had seen George near the study the night of the death. Mrs. Crane said she had not. She said George had left with the other guests at 11. She said she had watched them go. She said she could not say if he had returned. Miss Marple asked about Catherine. Mrs. Crane said Catherine had been devoted to her uncle despite their arguments. She said Catherine had brought him tea every evening. She said it was a ritual. She said Catherine had seemed more distant recently. She said the engagement had caused much pain. Miss Marple asked about Thomas. Mrs. Crane said she had been shocked to see him. She said she had not known he was in England. She said he had not visited before the death. She said his timing troubled her. She said old wounds do not heal easily. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Crane for her honesty. She said the truth would emerge. She said justice would be served. Mrs. Crane nodded. She said she hoped so. She said the Colonel had been difficult, but he did not deserve to die. Miss Marple left the cottage as the rain began. She walked slowly through the garden. She stopped at the spot where the ashes had been emptied. She crouched down. She examined the soil. She found nothing. She had not expected to. She returned to Ashwood House. She found Inspector Craddock in the study. She told him what Mrs. Crane had said. She told him about the footsteps. She told him about the fire poker. She told him about the ashes. Inspector Craddock listened carefully. He said the toxicology report had arrived. He said digitalis had been confirmed. He said the quantity was significant. He said death would have been slow but certain. He said the poison had been in the tea. Miss Marple nodded. She had known. Inspector Craddock said he would question each suspect again. He said he would search for the source of the digitalis. He said the garden was the obvious place. Miss Marple agreed. She said she had noticed cut stems. She said someone had harvested the leaves recently. Inspector Craddock said he would have the garden examined. He thanked Miss Marple for her assistance. She said she was always happy to help. She said the truth mattered more than comfort. Inspector Craddock smiled faintly. He said he had learned that from her. Miss Marple left Ashwood House. She walked home through the rain. She thought of Mrs. Crane's words. She thought of the footsteps. She thought of the fire poker. She thought of the burnt paper. She thought of the scent like almonds. She sat by her own fire. She knitted slowly. She thought of a case from her past. A maid had heard footsteps and said nothing. The murderer had walked free for months. The truth had emerged only when the maid had finally spoken. Miss Marple had learned then that silence protects the guilty. Mrs. Crane had spoken. The truth was closer now. The hearth would yield its secrets. Miss Marple was certain of it. Chapter 5. The Brothers' Return. The fifth day brought clear skies and cold wind. Miss Marple decided to visit Thomas Hargrove. She walked to the Blue Boar Inn. The innkeeper greeted her warmly. She asked if Mr. Hargrove was available. The innkeeper said he was in the parlour. She was shown in. Thomas sat by the window with a cup of tea. He looked tired. He rose when Miss Marple entered. He greeted her politely. She accepted his offer of tea. They sat across from each other. The fire crackled softly. Miss Marple began with pleasantries. She asked how Thomas found St. Mary Mead after so many years. Thomas said it had not changed. He said the village felt smaller than he remembered. He said returning had been strange. He said he felt like a stranger. Miss Marple asked about his time in Ceylon. Thomas spoke more freely. He said he had worked on tea plantations. He said the work had been hard but rewarding. He said he had learned much about plants and soil. He said the heat had been relentless. He said he had missed England. Miss Marple asked why he had left. Thomas hesitated. He said the quarrel with his brother had made staying impossible. He said he had hoped distance would heal the wound. He said it had not. He said he had carried the anger for 20 years. Miss Marple asked what the quarrel had been about. Thomas said it was about land. He said their father had left equal shares to both brothers. He said the Colonel had managed the estate. He said Thomas believed the Colonel had taken more than his due. He said the Colonel denied it. He said they had never resolved it. Miss Marple asked if Thomas had tried to reconcile before now. Thomas said he had written letters. He said the Colonel never replied. He said he had given up hope. He said something had changed 6 months ago. He said he had felt compelled to try again. He said he could not explain it. Miss Marple asked if Thomas had known about the will. Thomas said he had not. He said he had learned of it only at the reading. He said he was shocked. He said he did not want the estate. He said it felt like blood money. Miss Marple asked what he meant. Thomas said the Colonel had punished Catherine to reward him. He said it was cruel. Miss Marple asked if Thomas had met with Mr. Pembridge before the Colonel's death. Thomas admitted he had. He said he had wanted to know if the estate was in order. He said he had wanted to know if reconciliation was possible. He said Mr. Pembridge had been vague. He said he had left disappointed. Miss Marple asked why Thomas had not visited Ashwood House before the death. Thomas said he had been afraid. He said he feared rejection. He said he feared the Colonel's anger. He said he had stayed at the inn and hoped for courage. He said courage had come too late. Miss Marple sipped her tea. She asked if Thomas had been in the village the night of the Colonel's death. Thomas said he had. He said he had walked through the streets. He said he had stood outside Ashwood House. He said he had seen the lights. He said he had not knocked. He said he had returned to the inn. Miss Marple asked what time he had returned. Thomas said it was near midnight. He said the innkeeper could confirm it. Miss Marple said she believed him. She asked if Thomas had seen anyone else near Ashwood House. Thomas said he had not. He said the streets were empty. He said the rain had begun. Miss Marple asked if Thomas knew of poisons. Thomas smiled faintly. He said everyone who worked in Ceylon learned of poisons. He said the plants there were often dangerous. He said he had learned to identify them. He said he had learned their uses. He said knowledge was necessary for survival. Miss Marple asked if Thomas knew of digitalis. Thomas said he did. He said it was common in England. He said it came from foxglove. He said it could be medicinal or deadly. He said the dose determined the outcome. Miss Marple nodded. She asked if Thomas had visited the Colonel's garden. Thomas said he had. He said he admired the plants. He said the foxglove reminded him of his childhood. Miss Marple asked if Thomas had taken any leaves. Thomas looked at her sharply. He said he had not. He said he had no reason to. He said he had not wished his brother dead. He said he had wished only for peace. Miss Marple said she believed him. Miss Marple asked about the ring Thomas wore. She said it was identical to one the Colonel had worn. Thomas looked at his hand. He said it had been their father's. He said there were 2 rings. He said each brother had received one. He said it was the only thing they had not fought over. Miss Marple asked if Thomas had given up hope of reconciliation. Thomas said he had tried once more. He said he had written a final letter. He said he had delivered it to Ashwood House 3 days before the death. He said he had left it with Mrs. Crane. He said the Colonel never responded. He said that silence had been the final rejection. Miss Marple asked if the letter still existed. Thomas said he did not know. He said he assumed the Colonel had destroyed it. He said it no longer mattered. He said the Colonel was gone. He said the past was gone with him. Miss Marple thanked Thomas for his time. She said she understood his pain. She said losing a brother was always difficult. She said losing one without reconciliation was worse. Thomas nodded. His eyes were wet. Miss Marple left quietly. She walked through the village. She thought of Thomas's words. She thought of the letter. She thought of Mrs. Crane saying she smelled burnt paper. She thought of the hearth. She thought of the ashes. She thought of the truth hidden in the remains. She stopped at the post office. She asked Mrs. Pike if any letters had been delivered to Ashwood House recently. Mrs. Pike said several had. She said one had been hand-delivered by a gentleman 3 days before the Colonel's death. She said she had not seen who. She said Mrs. Crane had accepted it. Miss Marple thanked her. She walked home. She sat by her fire. She thought of Thomas standing outside Ashwood House. She thought of the letter he had written. She thought of the Colonel reading it. She thought of the Colonel burning it. She thought of someone else being in the study that night. Inspector Craddock visited her that evening. She told him about the letter. She told him about Thomas's visit to the house. She told him about the burnt paper. Inspector Craddock listened carefully. He said he would question Mrs. Crane again. He said he would search for any remaining fragments in the garden. Miss Marple said she believed the letter was the key. She said the killer had burned it to hide evidence. She said the hearth had been used deliberately. She said the killer knew the house well. Inspector Craddock agreed. He said the circle of suspects was narrowing. Miss Marple knitted slowly. She thought of human nature. She thought of greed and desperation. She thought of how far people would go to protect themselves. She thought of the hearth and the secrets it still held. The fire burned low. The night grew dark. The truth was close now. The hearth would speak. Miss Marple would listen. Chapter 6. The niece's confession. The 6th morning dawned with frost. The village sparkled under pale sunlight. Miss Marple tended her garden briefly. The cold bit at her fingers. She thought of Catherine Hargrove. She thought of the young woman's grief. She thought of the anger that had driven a wedge between niece and uncle. She was preparing tea when Catherine arrived. The young woman stood at the door, pale and trembling. Miss Marple welcomed her inside. She guided her to the fire. She poured tea. She waited. Catherine spoke haltingly. She said she could not sleep. She said guilt weighed on her. She said she needed to speak the truth. Miss Marple said truth was always the right choice. Catherine nodded. She began her confession. She said she had been angry with her uncle. She said the anger had consumed her. She said she had argued with him the day before his death. She said the argument had been fierce. She said she had said things she regretted. She said she had wished him gone. Miss Marple asked what had been said. Catherine said she had accused him of cruelty. She said she had called him heartless. She said she had told him she hated him. She said he had stared at her coldly. He had said she was ungrateful. He had said she would inherit nothing. He had said she would regret her words. Catherine said she had left in tears. She said she had returned that evening only because it was her habit. She said she had brought his tea as always. She said she had not spoken to him. She said she had left the tray and gone. She said she had not looked back. Miss Marple asked if Catherine had prepared the tea herself. Catherine said she had not. She said Mrs. Crane had prepared it. She said Catherine had simply carried it to the study. She said she had not touched the cup. She said she had not added anything. Miss Marple asked if Catherine had returned to the study later. Catherine said she had not. She said she had gone home. She said she had cried. She said she had told Peter everything. She said Peter had been furious. She said he had urged her to fight the disinheritance. She said she had refused. Miss Marple asked where Peter had been that night. Catherine hesitated. She said he had been at home. She said he lived in the next village. She said he had not come to St. Mary Mead. She said she had not told him the colonel had died until the next morning. She said he had been shocked. Miss Marple asked if Peter knew of plants. Catherine said he did. She said he taught science. She said he had studied botany as well. She said they had discussed plants often. She said it was a shared interest. Miss Marple asked if Peter knew of digitalis. Catherine said he did. She said everyone with botanical training knew of it. Catherine said she feared the inspector suspected her. She said she had motive. She said she had knowledge. She said she had access. She said she looked guilty. She said she was not. She said she swore she had not harmed her uncle. She said she had only wished him gone. She said wishing was not the same as doing. Miss Marple said she believed her. She said grief and guilt often looked the same. She said Catherine carried the former, not the latter. She asked if Catherine had told the inspector everything. Catherine said she had. She said the inspector had questioned her twice. She said he had been kind but firm. Miss Marple asked if Catherine had seen anyone else near Ashwood House that night. Catherine said she had not. She said the streets were empty. She said the rain had begun. She said she had hurried home. She said she had not looked back. Miss Marple asked if Catherine knew Thomas well. Catherine said she did not. She said Thomas had left before she was born. She said she knew him only through stories. She said the stories were not kind. She said her uncle had spoken of Thomas with bitterness. She said Thomas had been the betrayer. She said Thomas had been the greedy one. Miss Marple asked if Catherine believed that. Catherine said she did not know. She said she had met Thomas at the will reading. She said he seemed sad, not greedy. She said he seemed lost. She said he had offered to renounce the inheritance. She said she had refused. She said it would solve nothing. Miss Marple asked what Catherine would do now. Catherine said she did not know. She said she had Peter. She said they would marry regardless. She said they would manage. She said love mattered more than money. Miss Marple smiled. She said that was wisdom. Catherine asked if Miss Marple believed the inspector would find the killer. Miss Marple said she did. She said truth always emerged. She said the hearth held the final clue. She said patience was required. Catherine asked what she meant. Miss Marple said, "Only that fire reveals as much as it consumes." Catherine left shortly after. She thanked Miss Marple for listening. She said she felt lighter. She said confession had eased her burden. Miss Marple watched her go. She thought of the young woman's pain. She thought of the love that sustained her. She thought of Peter. She decided to visit Peter Grant. She asked directions from the postmistress. She walked to the next village. She found Peter at the schoolhouse. He was a young man with kind eyes and steady hands. He greeted Miss Marple with surprise. She said she was a friend of Catherine's. She said she wished to speak with him briefly. Peter invited her into his classroom. They sat at the small desks. Miss Marple asked about his relationship with Catherine. Peter spoke warmly. He said he loved her deeply. He said the Colonel's disapproval had hurt them both. Miss Marple asked if Peter had been angry with the Colonel. Peter said he had. He said the Colonel's cruelty had been unnecessary. He said Catherine deserved better. He said he had considered confronting the Colonel. He said Catherine had begged him not to. He said he had honoured her wishes. Miss Marple asked where Peter had been the night of the Colonel's death. Peter said he had been at home. He said he lived alone. He said he had no alibi. He said he understood how that looked. He said he had not left the house. He said he had not known the Colonel had died until Catherine told him. Miss Marple asked if Peter knew of digitalis. Peter said he did. He said he taught it in his classes. He said it was a standard topic. He said he had never used it outside of education. Miss Marple said she believed him. She thanked him for his time. She walked home slowly. She thought of Catherine and Peter. She thought of their love and their struggle. She thought of the Colonel's cruelty. She thought of how anger could drive desperate acts. But she did not believe Catherine or Peter had killed the Colonel. She believed the killer was closer to Ashwood House. She sat by her fire. She knitted slowly. She thought of the hearth. She thought of the letter. She thought of the ashes. She thought of the person who had stood by the fire and watched it burn. She thought of the person who had added the poison. She thought of the person who had walked away. The fire crackled. The evening darkened. The truth was very close now. Miss Marple could feel it. The hearth would speak tomorrow. She was certain. Chapter 7. The poison revealed. The 7th morning arrived with cold clarity. Miss Marple woke early. She knew today would bring answers. She dressed carefully. She walked to Ashwood House. Inspector Craddock had summoned all parties. The toxicology report was complete. The truth would be spoken. The drawing room was filled. Catherine sat by the window. Thomas stood near the mantel. George Whitley sat near the door. Mrs. Crane stood in the corner. Dr. Fielding sat by the fire. Miss Marple took a seat near the inspector. Inspector Craddock began. He said the toxicology report confirmed digitalis poisoning. He said the quantity was significant. He said death would have occurred within hours. He said the poison had been administered in the evening tea. He said there was no doubt. He said the source of the digitalis was the Colonel's garden. He said forensic examination confirmed that foxglove leaves had been recently harvested. He said the cuts were clean and deliberate. He said the person who took them knew what they were doing. He said each person present had motive. He said each had opportunity. He said each had knowledge. He said the investigation had been difficult. He said new evidence had emerged. He said the truth was now clear. Inspector Craddock looked at George Whitley. He said George owed the Colonel £3,000. He said the Colonel had refused further loans. He said the Colonel had threatened legal action. He said George's financial situation was desperate. He said George had been seen arguing with the Colonel 2 days before the death. George shifted in his seat. He said he had argued with the Colonel. He said he had been desperate. He said he had begged for more time. He said the Colonel had refused. He said he had left in anger. He said he had not returned. He said he had not killed the Colonel. Inspector Craddock said George's alibi was weak. He said George claimed to have been at home. He said no one could confirm it. He said George had knowledge of plants from his time managing estates. He said George had access to the garden. He said George had motive. George said he was innocent. He said he had not poisoned the Colonel. He said he had not harvested the foxglove. He said his hands were clean. Inspector Craddock said that was not entirely true. He said George's hands bore faint stains. He said the stains were consistent with handling plant material. George looked at his hands. He said he had been gardening at his own home. He said he had been pulling weeds. He said the stains were from that. Inspector Craddock said perhaps. He said the laboratory would determine the truth. Inspector Craddock turned to Thomas. He said Thomas had returned to England at a convenient time. He said Thomas had met with the solicitor before the death. He said Thomas had known about the estate. He said Thomas had inherited everything. He said Thomas had motive. Thomas said he had not known about the will. He said he had not wanted the inheritance. He said he had come only to reconcile. He said he had delivered a letter to the Colonel. He said the Colonel had not responded. He said he had stayed at the inn. He said he had not entered Ashwood House before the death. Inspector Craddock said the letter was important. He said it had not been found. He said it had likely been burned. He said the hearth contained more ash than usual the morning after the death. He said someone had destroyed evidence. He said someone had used the fire deliberately. Miss Marple spoke for the first time. She said the letter was indeed the key. She said the killer had burned it to hide their presence. She said the killer had been in the study that night. She said the killer had used the fire to destroy proof. She said the killer had made one mistake. Inspector Craddock asked what mistake. Miss Marple said the killer had not burned the letter completely. She said fragments remained. She said those fragments had been emptied into the garden. She said she had examined the soil. She said she had found traces of paper. She said the paper bore ink. Inspector Craddock said the laboratory had confirmed it. He said the ink matched Thomas's handwriting. He said the letter had been addressed to the Colonel. He said it spoke of reconciliation. He said it also spoke of money. He said Thomas had asked for financial help. Thomas said he had asked for help. He said he had been honest. He said he had hoped his brother would forgive him. He said he had not killed the Colonel. He said the letter proved nothing. Miss Marple said the letter proved someone else had been in the study. She said someone else had read the letter. She said someone else had realized its significance. She said someone else had burned it to hide their own actions. She said that person was the killer. Inspector Craddock asked who. Miss Marple looked at George Whitley. She said George had been desperate. She said George had known the Colonel would not relent. She said George had known about the garden. She said George had harvested the foxglove. She said George had prepared the poison. She said George had returned to Ashwood House after the guests left. She said he had entered through the garden door. She said he had found the Colonel alone. She said he had found the letter on the desk. She said he had realized Thomas's return complicated everything. She said he had acted. She said George had added the poison to the tea. She said the Colonel had already been drinking it. She said George had stirred it to ensure the mixture. She said George had waited. She said the Colonel had grown ill. She said George had taken the letter. She said George had burned it in the hearth. She said George had left quietly. She said George's mistake was the scent. She said Mrs. Crane had smelled burnt paper. She said the scent was faint but present. She said George had also moved the fire poker. She said he had stirred the ashes to ensure the letter was destroyed. She said he had not realized Mrs. Crane would notice. She said George's second mistake was his hands. She said the stains were not from weeding. She said they were from handling foxglove. She said the laboratory would confirm it. She said George's desperation had driven him to murder. She said his greed had betrayed him. George stood suddenly. He said it was all lies. He said he had not killed the Colonel. He said he had not been at Ashwood House that night. He said he had no proof, but he swore it. His voice broke. His hands shook. He sat down heavily. Inspector Craddock said the evidence was clear. He said George would be taken into custody. He said further investigation would confirm the details. He said justice would be served. He approached George. He placed him under arrest. George wept. He said he had been desperate. He said the debts had consumed him. He said the Colonel had been cruel. He said he had not planned to kill him. He said he had only wanted to frighten him. He said the poison had been meant as a threat. He said the Colonel had drunk too much. He said it had been an accident. Miss Marple said poison was never an accident. She said George had known the dose. She said George had known the outcome. She said George had chosen murder. She said desperation did not excuse it. George was led away. The room fell silent. Catherine wept quietly. Thomas stood by the mantel, his face unreadable. Mrs. Crane bowed her head. Dr. Fielding sighed deeply. Miss Marple sat by the fire. She thought of the hearth. She thought of the ashes. She thought of the truth finally revealed. Inspector Craddock thanked Miss Marple. He said her observations had been invaluable. He said the case was now closed. He said George would face trial. He said justice would be served. Miss Marple said justice was always served in the end. She said human nature could not hide forever. She left Ashwood House as the afternoon faded. She walked home slowly. She thought of George's desperation. She thought of the Colonel's cruelty. She thought of how easily lives unravelled. She thought of the hearth and the secrets it had held. The village would talk for weeks. The trial would be held in Much Benham. George would be convicted. The truth was out. The poison had been revealed. The hearth had spoken. Chapter 8. The Truth by the Hearth. The 8th day dawned with gentle rain. The village felt quieter. The mystery had been solved. George Whitley sat in a cell in Much Benham. The trial date had been set. Life in St. Mary Mead returned to its rhythms. But Miss Marple knew one task remained. She had asked Inspector Craddock to arrange a final gathering. She said closure was necessary. She said those who had suffered deserved understanding. Inspector Craddock agreed. He summoned all parties to Ashwood House one last time. They gathered in the drawing-room. Catherine sat by the window. Thomas stood near the mantel. Mrs. Crane stood by the door. Dr. Fielding sat by the fire. Inspector Craddock stood near the hearth. Miss Marple took her usual seat. The fire burned low. Miss Marple began gently. She said she wished to speak of human nature. She said murder was never simple. She said it was born of desperation and fear. She said George Whitley had been a desperate man. She said desperation had driven him to terrible choices. She said the Colonel had been a difficult man. She said his cruelty had wounded many. She said Catherine had suffered his disapproval. She said Thomas had suffered his rejection. She said George had suffered his refusal. She said the Colonel's heart had been closed. She said that closure had consequences. She said George had owed £3,000. She said the debt had consumed him. She said he had begged for mercy. She said the Colonel had refused. She said the Colonel had threatened legal action. She said George had faced ruin. She said George had seen only one way out. She said George had known the Colonel's garden. She said he had managed estates before. She said he had knowledge of plants. She said he had harvested the foxglove on the night before the death. She said he had prepared the poison carefully. She said he had planned meticulously. She said George had attended the gathering on the night of the death. She said he had observed the Colonel's habits. She said he had seen the evening tea delivered. She said he had waited for the guests to leave. She said he had returned through the garden door. She said he had entered the study quietly. She said the Colonel had been alone. She said the Colonel had been reading. She said the tea sat on the table. She said George had added the poison. She said the poison was already steeped in liquid form. She said George had stirred it into the tea. She said the Colonel had not noticed. She said George had seen the letter on the desk. She said the letter was from Thomas. She said it spoke of reconciliation and money. She said George had realized the letter complicated matters. She said George had taken it. She said he had burned it in the hearth. She said he had used the fire poker to stir the ashes. She said George had made 2 mistakes. She said the first was the scent. She said burnt paper smells distinct. She said Mrs. Crane had noticed it. She said George had not considered that. She said the second mistake was his hands. She said handling foxglove leaves marks. She said the stains remained. She said the laboratory had confirmed them. She said George had left quietly. She said he had returned home. She said he had waited for news. She said the news came at dawn. She said the Colonel was dead. She said George had pretended shock. She said George had offered assistance. She said George had tried to appear helpful. She said his desperation had betrayed him. Miss Marple said the hearth had been the key. She said the ashes had held the truth. She said the fragments of the letter had revealed George's presence. She said the fire had been meant to hide evidence. She said instead it had revealed the killer. She said fire always spoke the truth. She said she had seen such cases before. She said human nature repeated itself. She said greed and fear drove people to darkness. She said desperation blinded reason. She said George had believed he could escape justice. She said no one ever did. Catherine spoke quietly. She asked if her uncle had suffered. Miss Marple said the poison had been slow. She said the colonel had grown ill gradually. She said he had likely believed it was his heart. She said death had come as he sat by the fire. She said it had been quiet. She said it had not been peaceful. Thomas asked if the letter had been important. Miss Marple said it had. She said it proved George had been in the study. She said it proved George had motive to destroy evidence. She said it proved George had been deliberate. She said without the letter doubt might have remained. Mrs. Crane asked if she could have prevented the death. Miss Marple said she could not. She said George had planned carefully. She said the poison had already been added. She said Mrs. Crane's observations had helped solve the case. She said that was her contribution. She said it mattered greatly. Dr. Fielding asked if he should have suspected poison sooner. Miss Marple said the symptoms had been subtle. She said the colonel's heart condition had masked them. She said Dr. Fielding had acted properly. She said he had ordered the toxicology report. She said that had confirmed the truth. Inspector Craddock said the trial would be straightforward. He said the evidence was strong. He said George's confession had sealed his fate. He said justice would be served. He said the village could rest. He said the mystery was solved. Miss Marple said one question remained. She asked Catherine what she would do now. Catherine said she would marry Peter. She said they would leave St. Mary Mead. She said they would start fresh. She said she bore no ill will toward Thomas. She said the estate was his by right. Thomas said he would sell Ashwood House. He said he could not live there. He said the memories were too painful. He said he would return to Ceylon. He said he would carry his brother's ring. He said he would remember the reconciliation that never came. He said he would try to forgive. Mrs. Crane said she would seek new employment. She said she had served the colonel faithfully. She said she had done her duty. She said she was ready to move forward. Miss Marple said she would write a letter of recommendation. Mrs. Crane thanked her. The gathering ended quietly. Each person left with their thoughts. The fire burned low. The hearth sat silent. The mystery was solved. The poison had been revealed. The truth had been spoken. Justice would follow. Miss Marple walked home through the rain. She thought of George and his desperation. She thought of the colonel and his cruelty. She thought of how lives intersected and shattered. She thought of the hearth and the ashes. She thought of the truth that always emerged. She sat by her own fire. She picked up her knitting. She thought of St. Mary Mead and its endless dramas. She thought of human nature and its patterns. She thought of the next mystery that would surely come. She was ready. The rain continued softly. The fire crackled. The village settled into peace. The hearth at Ashwood House would grow cold. The truth had been revealed. The candle's flame burned steady. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked rhythmically. Each stitch reflected the tangled hearts of humankind. Candlelight outro, and so, dear listener, Miss Marple and the Poison by the Hearth draws to its quiet close. The candle's flame glows steadily again. Its light rests gently on the revealed truth. In St. Mary Mead, peace returns, and Miss Marple's knitting resumes. Each stitch reflects the tangled hearts of humankind. Until next time, dear listener, another secret fades by candlelight.